Have you ever been in an argument where you know, with 100% certainty, that you are correct, yet the other person, who is demonstrably uninformed, speaks with such monolithic confidence that it makes you question if you're living in a different reality? Maybe it's your uncle at a family dinner, insisting he knows how to restructure the entire global economy after watching a single 10-minute YouTube video. Or perhaps it's a colleague who just joined the project last week, now lecturing you, the person who's been on it for 5 years, on how your job is done. You present facts, you show data, you quote experts, but nothing seems to get through. The harder you push, the more they dig in, and their confidence only seems to grow. You walk away from the conversation feeling exhausted, frustrated, and maybe, just a little bit, questioning your own sanity. That feeling, that maddening sense of powerlessness, is not in your head. It's a real, documented psychological phenomenon. And in this video, we're not just going to name it, we're going to dissect it. And most importantly, I'm going to give you a blueprint for navigating it. But I have to warn you, the solution is not what you think. It's not about having more facts or arguing harder. It's something far more subtle and far more powerful. The psychological beast we're confronting has a name, the Dunning-Kruger effect. First identified by psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger in 1999. It's one of the most fascinating and frequently misunderstood cognitive biases. At its core, it describes a brutal irony: the people who are the least competent in a specific domain are the most likely to dramatically overestimate their own ability. Simply put, they don't just not know. They don't know that they don't know. And here is the most crucial thing to understand right from the start. The part most people miss: this isn't about arrogance. It's not about an overinflated ego. It's not a character flaw. It's a cognitive blind spot, a glitch in our mental software. The very skills required to be good at something are often the same skills required to recognize how good you are. When you lack those skills, you not only perform poorly, you lack the very ability to accurately evaluate your poor performance. You see, your frustration is valid. You are not crazy. You're running up against a psychological wall. You're trying to use logic to overcome a barrier that isn't built with logic. And that is why your usual strategies, arguing, presenting facts, showing exasperation, always fail. They are the equivalent of trying to use a house key to open a fingerprint scanner. You are using the wrong tools. In this video, we're going to give you the right toolkit. But first, we need to understand exactly how the machine we're up against works. Why is the human brain so vulnerable to this trap? The answer lies in a concept called metacognition, and the lack of it is the root of all the trouble. Let's travel back to 1999 at Cornell University. Dunning and Kruger were inspired by the bizarre story of a bank robber named MacArthur Wheeler, who held up to banks in broad daylight with his face uncovered. When he was arrested, he was in total shock. He muttered to the police, "But I wore the juice." Wheeler had naively believed that rubbing lemon juice on his face would make him invisible to security cameras, a belief he tested by taking a Polaroid of himself while not looking at the camera. This incredible naivety sparked a question in Dunning and Kruger. Could it be that incompetence not only makes people make bad decisions, but also robs them of the ability to realize those decisions are bad? They designed a series of studies. They tested students on areas like grammar, logic, and humor. Then, they asked each student to estimate how well they did compared to everyone else. The results were staggering and consistent. The students in the bottom quartile, the lowest scorers, didn't just perform poorly. They grotesquely overestimated their performance. They thought they had done better than average, when in reality they were near the very bottom. Conversely, the top performers had a slight tendency to underestimate their performance. They knew what they didn't know. This is the core definition of the Dunning-Kruger effect, a cognitive bias, where people of low ability suffer from illusory superiority, mistakenly assessing their ability as much higher than is accurate. So, what is the psychological engine behind this? The answer is one word: metacognition. Metacognition is simply the ability to think about your own thinking. It's the internal voice that allows you to step back and objectively evaluate your own knowledge, skills, and understanding. It's the thing that tells you, wait, maybe I should double-check that. Or I'm not really an expert on astrophysics, so I should probably listen more than I talk. In a person who is incompetent in a specific area, that metacognitive ability is severely impaired. Dunning calls this a double burden. The first burden is that they lack the skills. The second and more devastating burden is that their lack of skill robs them of the ability to realize they lack skill. Imagine trying to learn a new language. A total beginner can't even tell the difference between correct and incorrect pronunciation. They can't hear their own mistakes. It takes a certain level of proficiency to even begin to recognize the nuances you're missing. Knowledge and self-awareness are intertwined. The brain of someone experiencing the Dunning-Kruger effect lacks an internal error-checking system. For that domain, when they reach a conclusion, there is no mental process that flags it as potentially wrong. To them, their thoughts and conclusions feel just as valid and well-founded as the thoughts of a true expert. Now, there is a massive misconception we need to address. It's easy to hear about this and think, so these people are just arrogant idiots. That is not only unhelpful, it's incorrect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is not a permanent personality trait. It is domain-specific. And here's the scary part. We are all victims of it. A brilliant astrophysicist might have a severe case of Dunning-Kruger when it comes to investment strategy. A world-class chef might be supremely confident and utterly wrong about how to fix a car engine. You have areas where you don't know what you don't know. The difference lies in intellectual humility, the ability to recognize the boundaries of your own knowledge. Another key nuance is the inverse. Dunning and Kruger also found an imposter syndrome in the most competent people. Because they found the tasks easy, they assumed they were easy for everyone else, and thus they underestimated their relative ability. So the goal here is not to feel superior to people exhibiting this effect. The goal is to recognize it as a common human bug, a blind spot we all share, so that we can engage with it more effectively and empathetically. Why does any of this matter? Because the Dunning-Kruger effect isn't just a fun textbook concept. It is real, damaging consequences in the real world. In the workplace. It creates confident but incompetent micromanagers who demoralize employees and make poor business decisions. It leads to team members who refuse feedback, convinced their way is the only right way, stifling innovation. In medicine, it can lead to patients ignoring a doctor's advice because they did their own research on Google for an hour. And on social media, it is the engine that drives the spread of misinformation. People with a superficial understanding of complex topics, vaccines, climate change, economics become the loudest and most confident voices, drowning out actual experts. Think back to your uncle at the family dinner. Partially resolving open loop number 1. Your frustration isn't just about who's right. It's about a breakdown in communication. It's about how a relationship can be strained by an inability for one person to see beyond their own beliefs. When you multiply that by millions of interactions every day across the globe, you get a society that is increasingly polarized and disconnected. And that's why simply throwing facts at the problem fails so spectacularly. It ignores the core psychology at play. It triggers something called cognitive dissonance. Resolving open loop number 3. Their brain is faced with a choice: accept this fact and change my entire view of my own competence, or reject this fact to preserve my sense of self. The second option is infinitely easier. So, if facts aren't the answer, what is? Now, we move to the blueprint. Welcome to the Socratic Bridge. Our goal is not to win a battle, but to walk across a bridge together to a place of shared understanding. A bridge you build not with bricks of facts, but with carefully placed questions. Here are the 3 steps to building it. Step 1. Disarm. Don't debate your gut reaction when faced with confident incompetence is to attack. You must fight this urge. The moment they feel attacked, their defenses go up and you've already lost. Instead, start by disarming them. Find a point of common ground, no matter how small. Validate their right to an opinion, even if you disagree with it, instead of saying, "You're completely wrong about that. Try. That's an interesting way of looking at it. I can see why you might think that. I'm trying to understand it better." Phrases like, "Help me understand. I'm curious about your thought process. That's interesting. Can you say more about the X part?" You are shifting from an adversary to a curious collaborator. You are lowering the emotional temperature and creating a safe space for a real conversation. Only when they feel safe can they begin to entertain the possibility they might be wrong. Step 2. Ask calibrated questions. This is the heart of the Socratic Bridge. Instead of making statements, you ask genuine, open-ended questions that encourage them to reflect on their own logic. These aren't traps. They are invitations to explore. The goal is to help them discover the limits of their knowledge for themselves. Types of effective questions. Process questions. That's fascinating. How did you arrive at that conclusion? Or, what steps led you to that idea? This forces them to revisit their thinking process, which is where the gaps often lie. Evidence questions. What information did you find most convincing on this? Or, if we were to look for evidence that contradicted this, what might it look like? Consequence questions. If we were to implement your idea, what are the potential outcomes? Both good and bad? This shifts the focus from who is right to analyzing real-world results. For example, with your uncle and the economy. Instead of saying, "Printing more money causes inflation," try asking, "I'm curious, in your model, how do we manage purchasing power when the amount of money in the system increases?" You're inviting him to think through the problem with you. Step 3. Introduce external perspectives. Gentlines, you've laid a foundation of curiosity. And questions. You can begin to introduce other perspectives, but not as your own. Make yourself the messenger, not the source. Instead of saying, "I think that a try." I read an interesting article by a Nobel Prize-winning economist who suggested a different approach. She argued that, "What are your thoughts on that?" By doing this, you are depersonalizing the argument. It's no longer you versus them, it's their idea versus the idea of a credentialed expert. This allows them to consider a different viewpoint without feeling like they are losing an argument to you. You can say, "I'm still trying to get my head around it, but here's another perspective I found." Step for the bonus step. Know when to disengage. The Socratic Bridge cannot always be built. Sometimes, a person's belief is so tied to their identity that any questioning is perceived as a personal attack. You must learn to recognize the signs: rising anger, repetition of the exact same points, or personal insults. In these cases, the most powerful move you can make is to graciously disengage. You can say, "Thank you for sharing your thoughts. You've given me a lot to think about." Protecting your peace and your energy is also a victory. You are not obligated to fix every misconception you encounter. Sometimes, the best strategy is simply to walk away. We have traveled a long way, from the frustration of a fruitless argument, to understanding the psychological mechanics of the Dunning-Kruger effect, and finally to constructing our own Socratic Bridge. This blueprint: disarm, question, introduce perspectives, and disengage when necessary is more than just a communication strategy. It is a practice in intellectual humility. It reminds us that the goal is not always to be right, but to move closer together toward what is true. And perhaps the deepest lesson of the Dunning-Kruger effect isn't about them. It's about us. It's a powerful reminder to constantly check our own blind spots, to question our own confidence, to seek out perspectives that challenge us, because the universal human desire is not to be the person who knows the most in the room. It's to understand and to be understood, to connect. And that connection can only happen when we are willing to admit that maybe, just maybe, we don't know it all. I want to leave you with this question. In what area of your life might you be standing on your own? Personal Mount Stupid? Be honest with yourself. If this video gave you a new perspective, hit the like button and subscribe to Psych Blueprint for more deep dives into the human mind. And let me know in the comments which strategy from the Socratic Bridge Are you going to try first? Thanks for watching, and stay curious.